Warning: the following content may be considered disturbing to some. Viewer discretion is advised.
Fear in death, my powers continue.
On a warm, sunny day back in July of 2018, 18-year-old Alexis Stern of Big Lake, Minnesota, was sitting behind the wheel of her brand new cherry red Ford Fusion. It was a gift from her parents, earned by passing a recent driving exam, and in the passenger seat sat her boyfriend of just a few months, Robbie Olson. The young couple were in high spirits, enjoying their newfound freedom and soaking up the summer, but just after stopping for a bite to eat, Alexis's phone began to buzz. She checked the caller ID, only to see that it read caller unknown, so out of pure curiosity, she answered the phone. The caller introduced himself as a deputy from the Sherburne County Sheriff's Department, and to Alexis's shock, he asked her to report to the sheriff's office as soon as she was physically able. Alexis began to panic and asked the officer what kind of trouble she was in. The officer assured her that she'd done nothing wrong, but that she still needed to get over to the sheriff's office as quickly and safely as possible. Alexis drove over to the department's HQ immediately, and upon her arrival, she was rushed into an interview room by officers who moved with a frightening sense of urgency. Alexis had no idea what might have caused such a reaction, and for a while, she insisted it all had to be some kind of wild mistake. But there had been no mistake, and when the deputies explained what was happening, her head spun with disbelief. One of the deputies sat Alexis down and, in the most delicate of terms, told her of a frighteningly credible threat to her life. When a horrified Alexis asked who was trying to kill her, she discovered the deputies had no idea, hence why she'd been rushed to the department with such urgency. The only thing they knew was that whoever wanted her dead had hired a contract killer from a dark web black marketplace known as Camorra Hitmen. Just a few weeks prior to that fateful phone call, a user named Mastermind365 logged onto the Camorra Hitmen website using a variety of encryptors known as a Tor browser. There they sent the site's administrators a message asking if it was possible to purchase a kidnapping as opposed to a murder. The admin replied it was indeed possible, but given the additional risks associated with keeping the victim alive, the cost would be considerably higher. Mastermind365 took a few days to reply, but when they did, they seemed to have changed their minds. They wanted their target to be shot, execution style, giving them no chance of survival whatsoever. The user then sent just over $5,000 in Bitcoin to the organization's cryptocurrency wallet, along with a single digital photograph of Alexis Stern. That evening, Alexis drove back home under police escort. She was told the hit had only just been called in, meaning that she had at least a week or two before the hitman made a move. A professional would most likely take the time to case her house, track her movements, preparing and perfecting their plan while waiting for the optimal time to strike. But now that she was forewarned, Alexis also had time to prepare. Her parents installed a sophisticated home security system before purchasing a canister of military-grade pepper spray. She also signed up to MMA classes, and when her boyfriend heard of the threat, he bought a very large and very sharp variety of fishing knife just in case the pepper spray failed. Due to the high-priority nature of the assassination threat, the small-town deputies of Big Lake soon found themselves joined by federal agents from a number of different three-letter government agencies. The deputies would still be doing the legwork, but the feds were now running the show. When asked if there was anyone she'd angered or annoyed over the previous few months, Alexis seemed clueless. But then, investigators watched as something quite clearly dawned on her. Alexis then told them that sometime prior she'd broken off an online relationship with a young British man named Adrian Fry. Adrian seemed to have accepted her decision, but also seemed to have handled it very, very poorly. Yet no matter how heartbroken he was, Alexis refused to accept that he might have attempted to purchase her death. Adrian was the sensitive soul who would faint at the sight of blood, she said. He didn't even like violent movies, said they were too intense and gruesome for him. Federal agents made a note of the man's name and then assured Alexis that they'd be in touch. But over the next several days, Alexis's physical and mental health began to suffer. I was just constantly looking over my shoulder, keeping an eye on anyone that seemed to notice me, checking behind cars and under them, she said. You don't know what you're looking for. At this point, it's worth asking how a small-town sheriff's department came to learn of such an assassination plot. We might naturally assume it was the Department of Homeland Security that reached out to warn them. Failing that, the FBI or perhaps the CIA. But the truth is, there's only one person Alexis Stern has to thank for the advanced warning, and that person is Chris Montero. Chris is mentioned in another of this video's stories, the kidnapping of Chloe Ayling, as having debunked the Black Deaths Group's claims of being a powerful international human trafficking group. But that isn't Chris's only piece of stellar investigation. As we know, Chris spends a great deal of time acting as what's known as a white hat hacker, and often reports on what he finds during his in-depth investigations of dark web cybercrime. He routinely surfs the seedier corners of the web behind the web, and one night, he came across a website called Besa Mafia. The Besa Mafia claimed to offer the services of professional, often ex-military killers in return for large sums of Bitcoin. But murder was not the only service they offered. For the right price, a visitor could arrange for almost anyone to be beaten, tortured, kidnapped, or violated. The only variable factor was how long the job would take to complete. Besa Mafia's website was only slightly more polished than some of the other dark web murder-for-hire sites he'd stumbled across, but much like the others, he assumed it was nothing but a fake. Some were merely poorly coded jokes among college-aged computer science nerds, while others had been straight-up scams designed to siphon money from the bitter and gullible. Regardless, Chris wrote a brief blog post about the site, calling it out as an elaborate fraud, and then turned into bed for the night. The following morning, Chris woke up to an unusual-looking unread email in his inbox. The author referred to themselves as Yura, and claimed to be the Besa Mafia site administrator. Then, bizarrely, instead of threatening or attempting to intimidate Chris, Yura offered him around $1,000 in Bitcoin to delete his critical blog post. Assuming the offer to be fraudulent, Chris refused, but then a few days later, another email appeared in his inbox. Despite being from a different email address, the author once again claimed to be Yura, but the message contained a link to a YouTube video. Curious, Chris clicked the link and was redirected to a video of an old car sitting on what appeared to be a derelict lot. A masked and hooded figure then approached the car, doused it in gasoline, then set it alight. And then after doing so, the hooded figure approached the camera and held a small handwritten note in front of the lens. Dedication to Pirate London, it said. Pirate London is a reference to Chris Montero's cybercrime blog known as Pirate.London, and although that was a relatively simple connection to make, Chris admitted to being rather shaken. In retribution, Chris then dedicated himself to getting Besa Mafia shut down. He was soon successful, but was deeply unsettled when he discovered a brand new site up and running just days after the first had been erased. Chris once again focused his efforts, and the second incarnation of Besa Mafia was shut down too. But instead of giving up, Yura diversified. He created 2 websites, and then 3, and before long, murder-for-hire sites were popping up faster than Chris could take them down. Their only weakness was that they all operated via the same system. On each of Yura's websites, users were first asked to set up an entirely anonymous account, with the only rule being it had to be attached to a functioning cryptocurrency wallet. Users then could select from a drop-down menu of violent delights, each of which came with various customization and pricing options. Once selected, the user was then asked to upload the address of their intended victim, as well as a recent photograph for the purposes of identification. After that, they were simply asked to wait until the transaction could be dealt with. Bizarrely, Yura's websites operated much like any other online business. There was a recruitment section where wannabe hitmen could be sent over a short resume in the hopes of finding employment. But there was also an FAQ section where customers could find the answers to common questions and queries.
The son that is missing can
One
never
frequently
set.
asked question says, Yura, do you kill women? And the reply is chilling. Of course, Yura states, but some of our contractors might refuse, so please understand if there are delays in the fulfillment of your request. Such a layout might give the website an air of surreal, and in turn, it's easy to dismiss Yura's work as an elaborate scam, or even a compelling fiction. To this day, it's not confirmed if Yura really is some shadowy master assassin, but the people who seek to patronize his services are very real indeed. In February of 2016, another user logged onto the Vesa Mafia website under the username DogDayGod. After loading up their cryptocurrency wallet with more than $6,000, the user ordered the death of a middle-aged woman from Cottage Grove, Minnesota. The note on the request simply said, I need her dead. The target was a dog trainer named Amy Allwine, and in a follow-up message, DogDayGod fed Yura as much information about her as they could. This included details of her employment, where her son went to school, and the daily habits of her IT worker husband, Stephen Allwine. Yura claimed that he can make it look like an accident, perhaps a hit and run, or a freak fire. But on the proposed day of reckoning, nothing happened. DayDogGod sent what amounted to a letter of complaint to Yura, asking why he and his men kept failing. I do not care about date or method, they wrote. You have her picture and address, so you can tail her or do whatever you need to do to get this job done. I ask that you only get her and not the dad or kid, as the kid is a friend of our child's and I do not want to leave him orphaned. A few months later, another white hat hacker broke into one of Yura's websites and then forwarded every scrap of harvested data directly to the FBI. One of them was Amy Allwine. FBI agents rushed to the Allwine residence to warn Amy of the imminent danger, and left with assurances that security would be tightened. Much like the Stern family, Stephen Allwine made sure to have a sophisticated, cutting-edge security system installed in his home. And on top of that, he bought himself a handgun and then learned how to use it. Amy must have felt like she was in good hands. Her husband had spent a hell of a lot of money to ensure her protection, and although purchasing a firearm was rather out of character for him, it was touching that he'd do whatever it took to keep her safe. With that in mind, we can only imagine Amy's surprise when just a few months later, her loving husband walked right up to her, took out the gun he'd learned to operate so deftly, and shot her in the head with it. For years, Stephen Allwine had been arranging extramarital affairs using a website called Ashley Madison. He desperately wanted a divorce, but as an elder in the Midwest-based United Church of God, that simply wasn't an option for him. So, after taking out a $700,000 life insurance policy on her, Stephen created an account on a website that claimed to offer the services of contract killers, and the name he chose was DogDayGod. Stephen and Yura's chat logs would become a piece of key evidence during the investigation into Amy's death. After shooting her in the head, Stephen had tried to make his wife's death look like she had taken her own life. The chat logs proved it was not. In January 2018, he was convicted of first-degree murder and then sentenced to life in prison. But the conviction did not come easy. It has since emerged that America's FBI has refused to accept tips from British or European hackers and redirects them to their own national crime agencies, some of which refuse to deal with evidence obtained using so-called illegal methods. It also emerged that in February of 2017, Chris Montero had his apartment raided by heavily armed police before being arrested on suspicion of being the head of the Vesa Mafia. Apparently, as an act of subterfuge turned petty revenge, Yura had rather subtly suggested that his real name was Chris M., and that he was employed as a systems administrator at a London-based IT firm. This was picked up by white hat hackers who matched the information to Chris's real-life persona. Then before he knew it, he was being dragged away in handcuffs. It took 2 nights in a prison cell before police realized their mistake, but the damage had already been done. Yura had shown what he was capable of. In the weeks following Alexis's warning, she heard next to nothing from the FBI or local law enforcement. They'd promised additional patrols in and around her neighborhood, but Alexis had seen very little uptick in police activity. She had no idea how she was going to keep herself safe, but what she did have was a lot of spare time on her hands. Out of a combination of fear and stress, Alexis dropped out of community college, then quit her job at the local movie theater. I couldn't be left alone. I couldn't drive by myself. I had all my freedom taken away, she said. The only place I felt safe was with my boyfriend, Robbie, at his place over in Monticello. In the hours upon hours of downtime that she was faced with, Alexis started to doubt her original belief that her ex-boyfriend was incapable of hurting. Adrian was older than she was and earned good money as an accountant. He seemed mature and with plenty to live for, but he was also the only person she could think of who'd been upset with her, that also had access to thousands upon thousands of dollars. In March 2018, Adrian had flown over from the UK to visit Alexis in her native Minnesota. The trip started well, but over the course of the next 7 days, Adrian proved to be pushy, moody, and emotionally manipulative. When Alexis suggested they go out with her friends, Adrian declined, and after a number of derisive comments, became angry when Alexis decided to go alone. What's more, Alexis's mother and father had been kind enough to give Adrian a bed for the week, yet he showed no appreciation whatsoever and treated them with a vague disinterest. At the end of the week, Alexis decided she had enough, and after accompanying Adrian to the airport for his departing flight, she told him she wanted to break up. I said very clearly that I didn't want to be with him, and he tried telling me that I wasn't thinking right and I was making a mistake. He kept pushing it on to me and guilt-tripping me, saying he wouldn't find anyone else. It was deeply manipulative. In the end, it was hard evidence that changed Alexis's mind. Mastermind 365 had a distinct habit of writing "thank you" as all one word, something which seems particular to British English as opposed to American English. Secondly, Mastermind 365 attempted to use the dark web to purchase an illegal firearm, something they'd be able to do with perfect legality if they were a citizen of the United States. The third, and perhaps the most damning factor of all, is that Mastermind 365 changed their mind about kidnapping to settle on murder on the exact day that Alexis Stern told Adrian about her new boyfriend. The evidence reads like something out of an episode of Columbo, all tied up in a neat, shiny bow. But shockingly, no charges have ever been brought against Adrian Fry or the administrators of the Mesa Mafia websites. One might assume that's because these websites are fakes, guilty of other cybercrimes perhaps, but not conspiracy to murder. Yet you'd be mistaken, because as much as there's a sizable amount of proof that many murder-for-hire sites are fraudulent, there's even more evidence to suggest that many of them are very real. In June 2018, 21-year-old Private First Class Brian Naroje was found dead on the rural baseball field in Clark County, Indiana. Since the cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the head and the weapon was found at the scene of the crime, local sheriff's deputies quickly concluded that Private First Class Naroje's death was him taking his own life. There was just one problem. Private First Class Naroje's name was on one of the kill lists connected to Yura's websites. Just weeks before his death, a user named ToonBid had offered Yura $6,500 in Bitcoin in exchange for Naroje's death. However, this meant that Yura and his organization are directly responsible for the young soldier's death, as the person who wanted him dead could have hedged their bets, so to speak, and offered cash to a series of different contract killers, both online and offline, to ensure the job was done. It was also discovered that not long before his death, Private First Class Naroje named a female companion as the sole beneficiary of his life insurance policy. For legal reasons, this female friend has never been named publicly, but Naroje's father has since openly questioned whether his son's death truly was him taking his own life, or if there's some other, much more sinister explanation. Dark web assassinations have also occurred on the opposite side of the globe. On March 12th of 2019, 2 Russian teenagers were arrested following the murder of a prominent Moscow-based police officer known for his aggressive pursuit of narcotics traffickers. Much like Private First Class Naroje's case, the murder of the Moscow police officer was never directly linked to any of Yura's web pages. But according to the Russian journalists responsible for breaking the story, the killers were paid anonymously in Bitcoin and never once met the person who posted the job. This last case in particular has no ambiguity about it. Whoever paid for the hit might well remain anonymous, but the evidence is undeniable. There are indeed online services which offer a menu of murder, kidnap, and brutal assault. And if law enforcement has as hard a time taking them down as other dark web dens of iniquity, they'll be around for a long, long time
An ally has
to come.
been slain. Turret plating will soon fall.
Born on January 13th of 1963, Peter Gerard Scully was born and raised in the Australian city of Melbourne. Little is known about his childhood, though it's believed that he was raised Catholic by 2 strict Scotch-Irish parents. After graduating university, Peter made a living as some kind of property developer and became exceptionally wealthy in the process. By the mid-2000s, Peter was living with his wife and 2 children in a large 4-bedroom house in suburban Melbourne. He had a life that almost anyone would be envious of, but one day, his entire world began to fall apart. In 2011, Peter and his partners were forced to declare bankruptcy after a development scheme of theirs appeared to completely fall through. Very little work had been done on the actual construction site, yet Peter and his company claimed that every penny of the $2.6 million investment fund was gone. Naturally, their investors weren't happy and initiated legal proceedings against Peter and his partners. Peter claimed that he could account for losses in a way that was perfectly legal, but in reality, he was already preparing to flee the country. For years, he'd been scamming investors out of their money in what amounted to a very well-disguised Ponzi scheme. By the time it emerged that Peter was indeed acting illegally, he had already fled Australia on a false passport before establishing an entirely new identity in the Philippines' capital of Manila. Once he had established a degree of anonymity, and knowing that Manila was the first place Filipino police would look for him, Peter traveled over land and sea before reaching the southernmost island on Mindanao. It was here that Peter began setting up a new life for himself, and although he'd managed to flee Australia with a sizable amount of investors' cash, his expensive tastes meant that it would only be a matter of months before he was flat broke again. Peter needed a way of earning a living, yet he couldn't do so legally, as it would almost certainly give away his location to the authorities. He obviously wasn't afraid of operating outside of legal constraints, but with his reputation in tatters, there was no way of him securing any reliable outside investment. Peter needed money, he needed a lot of it, and he needed it quickly. So he turned to the darkest and most depraved of all online marketplaces, the exploitation of children. With the help of 2 Filipino women named Karma Ann Alvarez and Luisa Marcayo Castaño, Peter began setting up one of the most evil and prolific child exploitation websites in contemporary history. He would send Alvarez and Castaño out into some of Mindanao's poorest towns and villages, promising generous financial compensation to the parents of any child willing to hand them over for the purposes of a photo shoot.
This ring of life.
The children were then returned a few days later, visibly shaken, but with sizable wads of cash with them. The children either never spoke of the ordeals they'd faced at the hands of Peter and his so-called girlfriends, and those that did were either hushed up or disregarded. The harrowing abuse that took place at Peter's photo shoots were recorded before the videos were uploaded onto a dark web messaging forum that he created named Knowing It's Fun.
Has been slain.
The most notorious of these videos was entitled Daisy's Destruction and depicts the despicable abuse of 3 underage Filipino girls. A mere preview was uploaded to the webpage while Peter offered visitors the full unedited recording for around $10,000 US. One of the most active of the abusers in the tape was the 19-year-old Lizel Margaya, who had herself been trafficked at a similar age as the children that she ended up abusing.
Killing spree.
For 5 long years, Peter and his accomplices continued to traffic and abuse children until one day, Karma Alvarez appeared to have
Let
had
us
a change of
watch the
heart.
world end.
To Karma's knowledge, Peter's routine was simple. He'd trick a parent into giving him their child, record their exploitation, then return them with money. But even this had proved too burdensome on her conscience. She apparently pressured him to raise his age bracket, so to speak, and to introduce alcohol to the girls so they didn't suffer as much during the abuse. Peter seemed to have agreed to this, as in 2015, he coaxed 2 teenage girls back to his home with the promise of food and alcohol.
But another fallen
The girls
idol.
came willingly at first, but when it became evident that Peter planned to abuse them, and to document it no less, they attempted to escape. Peter and his photographer, the identity of whom remains unclear, apprehended the girls in the process of their escape, before brutally beating them and dragging them into the home's earthen cellar. There, each girl was forced to dig their own grave before Peter announced that they were to be buried alive. The girls begged and pleaded for their lives, swearing on all they held dear that they'd never breathe a word of what had occurred that evening. It was only then that Peter planned to let them go, confident that fear would forever seal their lips. But before that, he decided to hang on to them for a few more days, just to make sure that he'd made his point clear. It was during this period of captivity that the girls were discovered chained up in the basement by Karma Alvarez. Horrified at what Peter had done, she waited until Peter left the house and then freed the girls from their bindings and allowed them to escape. She then drove to the nearest police station and told the whole grim tale to a pair of dumbstruck police officers. To locate and infiltrate Peter's dark web exploitation ring, the Filipino police enlisted the help of the Dutch National Child Exploitation Team. The international barriers in this investigation disappeared very quickly, noted Dutch detective Farid El Hamoudi.
Has been slain.
Everyone wanted the same thing, getting the responsible people behind bars. The NCET's white hat hackers made short work of the website's digital defenses. It was a welcome breakthrough, but what they found was nothing short of traumatizing. Peter's website accounted for one of the largest collections of exploitative images police have ever found, with hundreds of thousands of
This
images
warmth in
accounting
us
for
is but
thousands
a
upon
fading
thousands of
ember.
potential victims. Peter's own contributions were merely the tip of the iceberg, but what police found most disturbing is the sheer demand for new content. The exact number of sales Peter made has never been made public, but the millions of dollars in cryptocurrency seized from his digital wallet gives us an idea of the sheer volume. When it came time to put Peter in handcuffs, an international dragnet ensured that he had no escape from the Philippines or its surrounding territories. Police eventually tracked Peter to Malaybalay City, where he was arrested February 20, 2015. His arrest and eventual conviction led to the apprehension of another Australian predator, 22-year-old Matthew Graham. Using the pseudonym Lutz, Graham ran a number of what he referred to as hurtcore sites on the dark web. These websites specialized in the proliferation of particularly violent child exploitation videos, and at his trial, Graham disgusted those in attendance by claiming that he had acted in the name of freedom. At his own trial, Peter Scully faced a grand total of 75 criminal charges, with most of them pertaining to the trafficking and exploitation of children. He was tried along with 2 other men, a Brazilian named Hano Caetano de Oliveira and a German man
Dark
named Christian
times bring
Rusch,
the brightest
who were
gold.
said to have played an intimate
Rampage.
role in the recording and dissemination of Peter's crimes. Prosecutors were able to confirm that Peter and his evil companions created a video involving the torture and exploitation of an 18-month-old baby. Sections of the video were shown to the jury, who later described how the girl had been hung upside down while the abuse took place. It should be noted that the footage was so graphic that several members of the jury sought psychological counseling in the aftermath of the trial, while prosecutors admitted to being traumatized at the trial's conclusion. "They were the most devastating thing I've ever seen," said Ruby Maloney. "I cried when I was watching them. In fact, I feel like crying just now while talking about it. It was hard to believe what I was seeing, and hard to believe that somebody could do those things to children." One of the top figures in the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime called the case the most horrific thing she'd ever had to deal with, with Peter's crimes being so severe that the Philippine government flirted with the idea of reintroducing the death penalty, which had previously been abolished less than 10 years prior. Northern Mindanao Chief Prosecutor James Unca was quoted as saying, "If I had my choice, it would be death for starving. I want to happen. We have to send a strong message to others that if they come to the Philippines and torture and abuse our children in this way, they will be investigated with the full force of law and executed." At one point during the trial, Peter Scully appeared to laugh and joke with his confidants. But when he was found guilty on 1 count of human trafficking and 5 counts of violating underage girls, he failed to see the funny side. The 6 counts were enough to secure a life sentence, but not all Peter's crimes have been accounted for. In November of 2022, Peter received a second conviction and was sentenced to an additional 129 years in prison, while his more repentant accomplice, Karma Alvarez, received life with the possibility of parole. Lazo Margallo Castaña was sentenced to 126 years in prison for being an active participant in the exploitation. 2 other accomplices, Alexander Lau and Maria Dorothea Chia, who were said to have played a lesser role in the exploitation ring, were sentenced to 9 years apiece. Since his imprisonment, Peter has complained of the conditions in the prison he's being held at, claiming overcrowding and underfeeding has led to a rapid deterioration in his health. Jail warden Ferdinand Quintilian told the media that he wants to be pampered with luxury food and a mobile telephone so he can make international calls. He wants the same conditions as there are in Australian jails, but this is not Australia. Peter has refused to comment on the allegations, but it stands to reason that his lifelong home is severely overcrowded. The Val Prison in Penal Farm was built to house no more than 350 prisoners, but as of November 2022, it was home to almost 2,000 inmates. Yet it's difficult to feel any sympathy for a man who showed such a despicable lack of mercy or empathy for those whose lives he succeeded in destroying, all for his own perverse financial gain. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Peter's case is that jailing him barely made a dent in the ongoing effort to rid the world of child exploitation. There are many more monsters like Peter, who lurk in the darkest, most forbidden corners of the dark web, dedicated to spreading the most heinous, unforgivable filth known to man. The only silver lining of such a dark, foreboding cloud is that for every evil, dark web predator, there are a dozen equally dedicated law enforcement agents who want nothing more than to put them in handcuffs.
Enemy triple kill.
Born on October 24th of 1988, Matthew Alexander Falder grew up in an upper-middle-class family in the small English village of Knutsford in Cheshire. He later studied at King's Secondary School in nearby Macclesfield, where he apparently excelled in his studies before being accepted to study seismic oceanography at the University of Cambridge Clare College. Following his attainment of a bachelor's degree, Matthew continued in academia, earning himself a master's and doctoral degree throughout his years of extended study. He then went on to become a postdoctoral researcher and lecturer at the University of Birmingham, and was a popular extroverted young man with a large and close-knit social circle. Friends described him as hilarious and larger than life, but Matthew was harboring a deep, dark secret of horrifying proportions. During his first or second year of university, Matthew shared a house with several other young students. It was the kind of accommodation the Americans might refer to as co-educational, where students are trusted to choose the most suitable housemates or one another regardless of gender. This is how Matthew ended up living with an unnamed young woman who spoke with his boisterous, sometimes edgy sense of humor. On one occasion, Matthew joked with the woman about secretly filming her while she used the home's shared bathroom. The suggestion was so ridiculously out of character for Matthew that the woman simply laughed it off and didn't take the suggestion seriously at all. But the truth was, Matthew really had been filming her while she'd been showering. It wasn't a joke. It was a soft admission, and since it wasn't taken remotely seriously, it emboldened Matthew to continue such predatory behavior. And then, as the years went by, Matthew would crawl deeper and deeper into a web of digital depravity, resulting in one of the most harrowing criminal prosecutions in British judiciary history. Like many of his peers, Matthew spent a great deal of time using a computer for research, writing, and study. But since Matthew was a purely dedicated researcher, he was glued to a keyboard for anything between 12 to 16 hours a day. Others might have found that staring at a screen for that long to be somewhat tedious, but Matthew didn't have a problem with it at all. He delighted in internet culture. As he had began to navigate its exploits and inner workings, Matthew began to familiarize himself with what's referred to as Tor. Tor is actually an acronym standing for The Onion Router, a variety of free open-source software that enables anonymous online browsing and communication. It directs internet traffic via a free worldwide network that consists of more than 7,000 relays, all maintained by dedicated volunteers. Tor protects a user's personal privacy by concealing the location and usage from anyone performing network surveillance or traffic analysis. But like any tool, it can be used for good, or it can be used for evil. The only deciding factor is the user's intent. And in Matthew's case, his intent was nothing short of evil. Matthew began using his newfound anonymity to access violent child exploitation websites known as hurtcore sites. Under the usernames 666devil and evilman, Matthew not only viewed some of the most graphically disturbing videos in existence, but he also downloaded and circulated them in other corners of the dark web. These videos didn't just include those which depicted the abuse of children, but also the torture and execution of adults, the elderly, and animals. Browsing websites such as Hurt to the Core and No Limits Fun was Matthew's idea of relaxing recreation after a hard day's research. But Matthew got his kicks in other ways too. At some point around the year 2009, Matthew began catfishing a series of unsuspecting internet users. At first it was harmless fun, like contacting online sellers to demand outrageously low prices for their goods. Then it escalated to catfishing naive young people and to showing up to remote places for dates that never happened. But instead of growing bored of such tomfoolery, Matthew continued to escalate the scope and scale of these catfishing incidents, and the longer he did it, the darker they became. It's believed that sometime in the early 2010s, Matthew came across an advertisement on the online marketplace Gumtree.com. It had been posted by a 14-year-old girl who wished to find herself some weekend babysitting work in order to earn some pocket money. Posing as similarly aged art student named Liz, Matthew reached out to the unnamed girl, initiated conversation, and slowly began to win her trust. Through the course of their conversations, Liz told the unnamed girl that she was drawing or painting a series of still-life images of human subjects. This is how Matthew slowly and methodically convinced the unnamed girl to send compromising pictures of herself, all under the impression that his motives were relatively innocent. Yet when she did so, the trap was sprung. Matthew revealed there was no Liz, and that if his teenage victim failed to comply with his every whim, the compromising photographs could be leaked online. He took his time in deciding what her first task would be, and when he finally emailed his demand to his still shell-shocked victim, she was beyond horrified. Matthew ordered the girl to take a photograph of herself within the toilet seat of her secondary school. The task would not only be extremely humiliating and unhygienic for his victim, but it would serve as a further blackmailing material, thus ensuring her continued compliance. The victim, who could not be named for legal reasons due to her age at the time of the offense, later gave an anonymous statement to the British media. "I was ashamed," she said. "Those pictures were awful and I didn't want any of my friends to think that I wanted to do that. But I also felt like no one would understand or believe me because there was no one there holding a knife to me and physically making me do it, even though that's what it felt like." Every single day for months on end, Matthew would text the girl with increasingly perverse and dangerous demands. "Every day when I woke up, there would be a message," she said. "When I came home from school, there would be a message. Even when we weren't talking, I was anxious because I was just waiting for the next message to come through." The stress of the ordeal had a devastating effect on the girl's studies and relationships. She stopped talking to her family. She stopped going outside. Every waking moment was spent trying to appease Matthew's will to prevent the pictures from being leaked. Eventually, as the girl approached the precipice of a complete nervous breakdown, she begged Matthew to leave her alone and confessed to wanting to take her own life. In a sort of abuse journal he kept on one of his favorite hurtcore websites, Matthew wrote extensively of the torment he inflicted. He boasted of trapping the 14-year-old into a web of blackmail and humiliation, claiming his intention was to mentally F her up, and that he didn't care if she lived or died. Other journal entries included a list entitled 100 Things We Want to See at Least Once. Two of the bullet points included were a young girl being used as a dartboard, and a video depicting a child's bones being slowly and deliberately broken. When the unknown girl brought up the topic of taking her own life, Matthew actually encouraged her to do it, claiming that he'd already uploaded pictures of her to hurtcore websites on the dark web. If she took her own life, those same pictures would find their way into the inboxes of her family, friends, and teachers. It's not clear when or how the unknown girl managed to evade Matthew, but we know that in at least one case, Matthew made good on his threats and sent compromising photographs of the girl to her own parents. It's more than likely that it's the same anonymous girl who gave interviews in the aftermath of her ordeal, as at one point, she's quoted as saying, "I don't talk to my family anymore. I guess for me, I felt like they wouldn't understand. Then when I finally told them, they didn't. They basically said it was my fault, and that's how the relationship broke down." Having completed the cycle of manipulation, blackmail, and abuse, Matthew simply moved on to another victim, and the contemporary internet proved rich pickings for such a devious predator. Using a series of 70 different carefully crafted fake personas, Matthew's hardcore blackmail operation continued for many years and with many separate victims. The identities of most of these victims has remained a closely guarded secret, but using a breakdown of the charges levied against him, we can put together a rather detailed picture of what Matthew forced them to do. Some of these charges are simply too obscene for even a hardened true crime channel such as this one, but of the more interesting and less obscene charges, there was, and I quote, forced compulsory labor. This meant that Matthew had blackmailed one of his victims into performing petty chores for him, essentially rendering them a modern-day chattel slave. Matthew was also charged with 3 counts of participating in the activities of an organized crime group, meaning there's a good chance Matthew shared evidence of his crimes with a large online network of predators. But it wasn't just indecent images that Matthew shared. The UK's Crown Prosecution Service later charged Matthew with 2 counts of possession of a predator manual. One is believed to have simply been downloaded by Matthew and was written by another source, whereas the second such manual was almost certainly composed by Matthew himself and detailed exactly how he was able to blackmail so many different people from many different walks of life, all at the same time. This manual was almost certainly found and downloaded by another British predator, a 36-year-old Norfolk man by the name of David Wilson, who admitted to 96 offenses related to child exploitation in early 2021. It seems the investigation into Matthew's online activities began sometime in 2013, and over the course of the next 4 years, Britain's National Crime Agency would be joined by none other than MI6, US Homeland Security, and the Australian Federal Police. The scope and scale of Matthew's offenses was so awful that even an unnamed Israeli intelligence agency became involved in the operation, who named him as one of the most prolific and dangerous cyber criminals in the entire world. In the beginning, William Kerr of British NCA complained that tech companies displayed less than ideal cooperation during their inquiry into Matthew's identity. He said they had to be shown images of underage girls eating their own feces before they took the investigation seriously. Despite not specifically naming any one company, Kerr also claimed their lack of cooperation allowed Matthew to continue offending for much longer than if they fully cooperated with their investigation. But regardless, after a long and thorough investigation into his online activities, including an undercover officer filming him using a tiny button camera, police officers apprehended Matthew at his place of work, and he was arrested on June 21st of 2017. After his initial hearing on October 16th of that same year, Matthew pled guilty to a jaw-dropping 137 separate offenses against 46 separate victims. 4 months later, he was sentenced to 32 years in prison, with an additional 6 years parole following his eventual release. Judge Philip Parker described Matthew as warped and sadistic, and that his behavior was cunning, persistent, manipulative, and cruel, and that he quite clearly reveled in the pain and anguish he caused. Ruana Igoyovle, a senior specialist prosecutor for the UK's Crown Prosecution Service, was quoted as saying that Matthew Falder is a highly manipulative individual who clearly enjoyed humiliating his many victims, and the impact of his offending in this case has been significant. He deliberately targeted young and vulnerable victims. At least 3 victims are known to have attempted to take their own lives, and some others have inflicted self-harm. There was a high degree of sophistication and significant planning by Falder due to his use of encryption software and technology in his electronic communication and the use of multiple fake online identities and encrypted email addresses. Matt Sutton, a National Crime Agency officer who also worked on the case, added that, "In more than 30 years of law enforcement, I've never come across an offender whose sole motivation was to inflict such profound anguish and pain." Matthew Falder reveled in it. "I've also never known such an extremely complex investigation with an offender who was technologically savvy and able to stay hidden in the darkest recesses of the dark web. This investigation represents a watershed moment. Falder is not alone, so we will continue to develop and deliver our capabilities nationally for the whole law enforcement system to stop offenders like him from wrecking innocent lives. I commend the victims for their bravery, and I urge anyone who is being abused online to report it. There is help available." In the immediate aftermath of his sentence, Matthew and his attorney launched an appeal, claiming that 32 years in prison was far too harsh a punishment for someone who'd never physically hurt any of his victims. Shockingly, the following year saw his sentence reduced from 32 to 25 years, with an additional 8 years on license. When news of the reduction hit the headlines, it caused a great deal of public outcry, but Matthew's parole board was quick to add that if he still posed a threat to children at the 25-year mark, he would be forced to serve the full 32 years before being released. In early 2018, Cambridge University stated that they were actively pursuing methods of stripping Matthew of his academic qualifications. At the time, there was no precedent of a removal process for its alumni, and with a lack of follow-up story, it's reasonable to assume Matthew's degree has not been taken away from him. But even if everything was stripped away, it still doesn't erase his crimes, and it still doesn't undo the suffering Matthew wrought. The sweetest justice Matthew's victims could ever receive is if governments around the world make a commitment to finding and erasing caches of online child exploitation content. Some say it's impossible, that once something is online, it's always online, but that simply isn't good enough. Long ago, the bandits of the western frontier were brought to heel by the hard work of good, brave men. And unless humanity finds the courage and resolve to finally deal with such an insidious threat, predators like Matthew will always have someone to turn to feed the lesser angels of their nature. Born July 17th of 1997, Chloe Ayling grew up in the South London suburb of Colston. She was raised by a single mother who worked hard to ensure that her daughter had everything she needed to thrive in both her education and her social life. After excelling in her GSCE exams at the age of 16, Chloe went on to study psychology, business, and law at a local sixth form college. She told her mother that she aspired to be a lawyer, but in late 2014, Chloe became pregnant and dropped out of school. She was a young woman in crisis. As a newly expectant mother, she had zero prospects and a deeply uncertain future. But at the same time, Chloe was deeply committed to providing a prosperous future for both herself, her mother, and her unborn child. Having enjoyed athletics and physical training while at school, Chloe decided to pursue a fast-track sports science qualification that would open the door to enjoyable work and decent wages. Yet during her period of study, she was approached by a modeling agent who proposed that she put together a portfolio. After a number of successful, highly publicized shoots, she was signed to the UK's prestigious supermodel agency headed by the notorious Phil Green. 56-year-old Green founded the not-so-creatively named Supermodel Agency back in 1987 and was once accused of being a little more than a high society pimp after he admitted to arranging parties involving wealthy celebrities and the girls on his payroll. Green has since insisted that there was nothing inappropriate about these parties, and a brief police investigation concluded that, while somewhat sleazy, his actions hadn't broken any laws. Yet we can't help but wonder if his penchant for making arrangements didn't factor into the fate of the newly signed 20-year-old Chloe Ayling. In March of 2017, Green received a phone call from a man calling himself Andre Lazio, who wished to hire one of his models for a photo shoot in Paris. Green decided Chloe was the best girl for the job, and in early April, he sent her off to Paris for a few days to complete the shoot. Yet just hours before it was due to commence, Lazio contacted Green to cancel. He apologized profusely, but promised to call back in a few months once the shoot could be reorganized. Green was displeased with the cancellation, yet Lazio proved true to his word, and in July of that same year, he called back for another proposal, this time in the Italian city of Milan on July 12th of 2017. Green agreed to the arrangement, but there was one small problem. There was no Andre Lazio, and Green had inadvertently shepherded his client into one of the most harrowing ordeals of her entire life. When Chloe failed to return home on the expected date, her terrified mother contacted Mr. Green to voice her fears. Mr. Green then attempted to contact the fictitious Andre Lazio, but none of his calls were answered. The next morning, Mr. Green noticed an unread email in his inbox, and upon opening it, his jaw hit the floor. The email stated that Chloe was now the property of an organization known as Black Death Group. In conjunction with Chloe's family, Mr. Green had 72 hours to deposit 300,000 euros worth of cryptocurrency into an online wallet, or she'd be auctioned off to the highest bidder via a dark web slave auction. The only signature on the email read, MD. A horrified Phil Green immediately reached out to the British consulate in Milan and requested immediate assistance in rescuing his imperiled client. Then, in coordination with British diplomats, the Italian police conducted a raid on the property believed to be Andre Lazio's photography studio. Once inside, the officers discovered it was no studio, but rather a filthy, cramped apartment with no electricity or running water. The place was empty and it looked to have been abandoned for quite some time. Yet piled up in the corner of the bedroom were several pieces of clothing, all of which were soon confirmed to be Chloe's. To some, it was an encouraging development. If her whereabouts could be tracked, it was only a matter of time before Chloe was returned home. Yet investigators had a very different perspective. You see, although some of Chloe's belongings had been recovered, there was no other forensic or digital evidence recovered from the apartment. There was no addresses to stake out, no phone numbers to tap, no persons of interest to keep tabs on. Nothing. For all intent and purpose, Chloe Ayling had simply dropped off the face of the earth. Yet less than a week after she disappeared, investigators were stunned when a young woman walked into the British consulate in Milan. They recognized the disheveled young woman in an instant. It was Chloe Ayling. She was in the company of a 30-year-old Polish computer programmer named Łukasz Herba, who previously lived in the UK, but at the time of Chloe's disappearance claimed to have been living in Rome. Both were taken into different rooms and extensively questioned by police. Then, as the interviews unfolded, the story that emerged was nothing short of preposterous. After being ushered into a small interview room, Chloe recalled the events of the day she vanished. After waking up in a dingy, cramped apartment she'd been assigned, Chloe was informed that a taxi would be arriving for her within the hour. She'd already complained to Phil Green regarding the condition of her accommodation, but she was told that there was little he could do. All of the local hotels were booked up, and unless she could find her own, Chloe would have to make do with the lodgings provided. It's only for one night, Green was reported to have said. Just get the shoot done, get paid, then after you fly back, we won't have to work with them again. Reluctantly, Chloe agreed to continue the plan, and after the arrival of her taxi, she was driven to a secluded warehouse just outside of Milan. For some, the choice of location would have immediately struck them as suspicious, yet for glamour model Chloe, it was nothing out of the ordinary. Many of her previous modeling assignments had been in unusual spaces, such as disused warehouses or derelict office spaces, and what appeared to be a deserted shell on the outside was actually a hive of activity on the inside, with pristine white backdrops surrounded by thousands of dollars worth of cameras and lighting equipment. But on this occasion, when Chloe walked inside the warehouse, she was greeted by utter silence. Freshly printed pieces of A4 paper with the word photo shoot written on them directed her to a small office room in the center of the warehouse, and after knocking on the door, Chloe suddenly heard someone rushing up behind her. When I felt a gloved hand over my mouth and nose, I panicked, she later said. My head was being held back, another arm pinning me across the neck. Then I saw another masked man rush in front of me with a needle. I tried to fight, but I couldn't. He grabbed my right arm, pushed up my sleeve, and I was wrestled to the floor. The masked man was over me, the syringe piercing my skin, and that's the last thing I remember. Sometime later, Chloe awoke in pitch darkness and quickly realized she couldn't move. She was still incredibly disoriented from the sedatives she'd been forcibly injected with, and it's possible that this was the only thing that prevented her from suffering a severe panic attack once she realized she was confined to a terrifyingly constricting space. There was black rubbery material all around me, and I soon realized that I was in some kind of bag, Chloe later said. I tried to open my mouth, but I couldn't. There was tape across it. Eventually, I managed to peel it off so I could breathe properly, but that's how I realized that there was metal around my wrists and ankles. They'd been handcuffed, too. Chloe recalled later in front of her was a small hole in the fabric of whatever she was imprisoned in. She pressed her hands together and forced her arms up until the tips of her fingers had reached it. Then, with all her might, she pushed, watching as the opening widened with just the smallest amount of effort. It was a zipper, and as she slowly freed herself from the confines of the bag, Chloe realized that she was in the trunk of a moving car. I tried to make some noise, to try and get the driver's attention, she recalled, so I was kicking my legs and screaming my head off. It worked, and Chloe soon felt the car coming to a stop. She then heard two loud bangs as both the driver and passenger side doors were opened and closed. The next thing she knew, there was a light and fresh air as the trunk that she was held prisoner in was suddenly opened. Yet staring back at her, backdropped by the night sky, were her two masked abductors. As tears filled her eyes and her voice shook with terror, Chloe demanded the men to tell her what was going on. Neither replied. They simply reapplied the tape around her mouth, tightened her handcuffs, and then pushed her back into the duffel bag that she had only just escaped from. Sometime later, the car stopped again. But this time, once her kidnappers opened up the trunk, Chloe realized they had driven her to a highly secluded location, far from any major highway. The first time the trunk had opened, she detected the faint orange glow of streetlights, but the second time, there was nothing but the starry night sky to greet her. As she was dragged from the trunk, the terror of uncertainty was overwhelming. Chloe once again tore the tape from her mouth and began begging her captors to tell them where they were. "You not get hurt," was all they said. And according to Chloe, they pretended not to know where she was being taken. "I started to cry," she later said. "It all just hit me at once and I couldn't help it. I cried for my mom and for my baby boy. I didn't know if I would ever see them again." Chloe was taken into what appeared to be some kind of farmhouse, then spent her first day and night handcuffed to a water pipe in the basement. She was fed minimal food and water and suffered heavily from the residual effects of the sedatives she'd been given, which were later revealed to be ketamine. On her second night, one of her kidnappers reappeared, but this time, he wasn't wearing any mask. He had a boyish face, close-cropped hair and pale blue-green eyes. Then as he approached, Chloe began to tremble with terror. Yet to her infinite relief, the man appeared to reassure her in broken English, then asked if she wanted to share his bed for the night. "I'm not going to say, no, I wanted to stay handcuffed in the furniture," she later said. "I would never object to something that he wants me to do in that time because I didn't want to upset him or make him angry. Why would I be nasty to him when he was my only way out?" In terms of ensuring her survival, Chloe said that she had one lone strategy: win her captor's sympathy. She didn't need to fake the tears that she wept for her infant son back home.
You can't tell it.
He'd been wondering where Mummy was, crying for her, and after repeatedly sharing this with her maskless captor, he began to display an obvious sympathy for her. Then bizarrely, Chloe's nameless captor asked if she'd be interested in dating him. The question horrified her, yet she shrewdly used it to her advantage. "Obviously, I had no interest, but I had to play it as if I did," she explained. "It was the only thing I had to focus on to get out. I hated drama in school and too shy for that, but what else could I do?" She told the man that in the future, if she was released safe and sound, she could possibly see herself dating him. The man became visibly excited at the prospect. Then, seeing his opportunity, Chloe asked the man his name. "My name is Wilkus," he replied. "Wilkus Herba." Chloe didn't realize it, but she'd seen that name before. In fact, she actually met Wilkus Herba face-to-face just months before her capture. Yet due to the stress of her experience, these little factoids would remain beyond her recollection. Yet when Wilkus finally decided to remind her, it was a moment of chilling significance. 6 days into Chloe's captivity, Wilkus walked down into the basement where she was being held and locked the door behind him. He looked frightened. Chloe feared the worst and began to talk. She hung on to every word as if her life depended on it. In reality, their first encounter had been 3.5 months earlier, during the debacle of the cancelled photo shoot in Paris. Upon learning of the cancellation, Chloe was assured that someone was on their way to give her money for a taxi and a plane ticket, and that man was Wilkus Herba. Wilkus went on to explain that he was a member of the Black Death Group, a violent Romanian people smuggling ring. Chloe began to panic, but Wilkus was quick to reassure her, claiming that she wasn't going to be sold into slavery because he wanted to leave the organization. However, in order to do so, he needed to raise 300,000 euros to buy his freedom, and that's where Chloe came in. Originally, he had been ordered to kidnap her back in April, where they'd met in Paris, but had refused his orders upon learning that Chloe was a single mother. According to Wilkus, his superiors severely reprimanded him for his insolence and set about organizing another snatch
An
attempt.
ally has been slain.
Wilkus claimed that he begged for redemption and was thus allowed a position in the Milan Snatch Squad in order to regain his boss's favor. But unbeknownst to them, he had other plans. After explaining his position to Chloe, Wilkus made it clear that it was in her interest to help secure the ransom money. Only one of his Black Death colleagues knew where they were, and it was only a matter of time before they returned without wise to his scheme. If that happened, Wilkus would be killed, and Chloe would be immediately sold into slavery, where a fate worse than death awaited her. Wilkus even explained that in one instance, a customer who'd grown bored of his purchase had her fed to tigers as a form of entertainment. Naturally, Chloe was paralyzed with fear, and although she could practically taste her freedom, she maintained her veneer of mild-mannered compliance. When Lucas asked who might have the money to pay her ransom, Chloe replied with the names of 3 older men, whose identities have never been made public. And this is when Lucas sent an email to Phil Green, demanding 300,000 euros under the pseudonym ND. He also included the names of the men Chloe had listed as being capable of paying the ransom. One of these men was said to be able to have 30,000 euros immediately to hand and could have it converted to cryptocurrency, then deposited into an account of Lucas's choosing within the 72-hour time frame. The offer was nowhere near the 300,000 needed to secure Chloe's freedom, yet bizarrely, Lucas chose to release her anyway. He did, however, have a number of conditions. Not only did he require an additional 50,000 euros in Bitcoin, Chloe would be responsible for spreading word of the Black Death Group in the United Kingdom, essentially as a way of spreading fear via propaganda. He claimed to have compromised with the superiors, who had laid out a new set of conditions for his departure from the group. Chloe agreed to his every stipulation, knowing she'd abandoned her promises once she was safely back in the UK. Once Chloe had sworn to obey his commands, Lucas drove her to Milan with the intention of escorting her to the British consulate. But before that, something rather unusual occurred. Lucas had previously assured Chloe that any escape attempt on her part would be futile. The Black Death had agents everywhere and, using a sophisticated system of signals and intelligence, would find and track her within minutes, not hours. Yet when they arrived back in Milan, the one place Chloe would have gravitated to during a potential escape attempt, Lucas seemed happy to waltz around the piazzas without a care in the world. He took Chloe to a cafe, they ate lunch together, then he bought her a pair of shoes as some kind of bizarre parting gift. After that, Lucas walked her to the British consulate, totally under the impression that he'd be free to simply walk away after dropping her off. Even when asked to step into an interview room, Lucas seemed perfectly confident he'd done nothing wrong. But as we know now, nothing could have been further from the truth. Yet as Chloe and Lucas's interview unfolded, the police took umbrage with one particular detail. She claimed that all her new clothes had been given to her at the farmhouse, yet when it was discovered the shoes were a recent purchase, the police checked the CCTV footage. They spotted Chloe and Lucas holding hands. Chloe had neglected to tell the whole truth regarding the day's events, and to her horror, it seemed to cast doubt on the entire story. It was the end of the interview. I'd been speaking for 12 hours and I just wanted to leave, Chloe later said. I thought that would be another whole load of questions, and it would drag on for so much longer, so I just didn't mention it. After she was returned home, it became increasingly obvious to Chloe that more and more of those investigating her kidnapping believed it to be some kind of hoax. It was so bad. I was shocked. I'd spent 12 hours giving as much detail as I can. Then one thing I don't mention and they don't believe me, she said. I was angry and frustrated, and I just broke down. Upon her return, she was questioned by a number of high-profile media personalities, one of which openly questioned the veracity of her story. No one can say that you should have acted in a certain way. How would you know how to react? Anything you think will get you free, you just gotta do it. She replied, if you just refuse to do anything, they say most people wouldn't come out alive. I'd rather have acted as I did and be here right now rather than act as people say I should have.
Royalty isn't earned.
When asked why she hadn't tried to make a break for it as soon as they arrived in Milan, Chloe replied, I was grateful to him. I relied on this man totally, even to this point where, when he wanted to drop me 20 minutes from the consulate, I couldn't bear to think about being separated from him, because I thought other members of Black Death would get me in the time that it took to walk there. It seems that, until the end, Chloe genuinely believed that Lucas was a member of the elusive and terrifying Black Death Group, but again, the reality couldn't have been any further from the truth. In the weeks following Chloe's return, and the media firestorm that followed in her wake, the Black Death Group gained more publicity than they ever could have wished for. There was just one problem. They didn't exist. At least not in the form that Lucas had described. You see, there was a group of scammers operating on the dark web circa 2016 who did indeed call themselves the Black Death Group. However, they were not in the business of human trafficking, and were more focused on things like scamming Apple Store gift cards from small-time code dealers. After a number of screenshots depicting Black
Kings
Death Group
come and
websites
go,
began to
but
circulate
gold
back in the
stays.
UK, it became apparent that they were legitimately trying to sell Chloe via a dark web auction. But again, this proved to be a complete fiction. The truth is, Lucas collaborated with the Black Death Group members to create mock-ups of a slave auction site
The only
and promised to
ally
pay
has
them
been
handsomely
slain.
once his plan was successful. It's entirely possible these mysterious darklings decided to leak the screenshots once they learned no money was headed their way. Amateur cybercrime researcher and self-proclaimed transhumanist Chris Montero wrote up a phenomenal
Honor is the
debunking of the Black
rust on
Death
a
Group
dull
on his
blade.
blog, pirate.london. There, he thoroughly proves that not only were the Black Death Group barely anything to worry about in terms of crimes they committed, but their role in Chloe's abduction was severely overstated in weeks following her return. Essentially, what happened here was a very poorly planned and very
You've got
poorly
a problem.
executed kidnapping
I've got a
committed by a
price.
dangerous, unhinged, and selfish young man. At his trial, Lucas seemed to change his story and attempted to exploit the rumors of a hoax by claiming all he'd done was try to boost his girlfriend's career with a fake scandal. Thankfully, the jury saw through his defense, and on June 11th of 2018, he was sentenced to 16 years and 9 months in prison. Lucas's brother, Michael Erba, who ran a transport logistics company called Trans Logistics Limited, also participated in the kidnapping. Based on email and forensic evidence, he was extradited from the UK to Italy in October 2018. In the following year, he was sentenced to 16 years and 8 months in prison. The story of Chloe's kidnapping and confinement is one of the most complex and convoluted ever covered in this channel. As we've stated, Chloe has been publicly accused of manufacturing her kidnap in order to boost her career, and although this can be said for certain other celebrities in recent years, it's clear that Chloe was not lying. Lucas Erba, in a pathetically selfish attempt to romance a girl he'd first stumbled across on Facebook, became the victim of his own scheme. He believed that he had fooled Chloe into believing in the Black Death Group's near limitless power, and to an extent,
An
it's
ally
true.
has been slain.
But Lucas was being fooled in return
An enemy
by a
has
girl
been
who
slain.
utilized her feminine wiles and some rather convincing acting in order to secure her eventual release. In a sense, what you just heard is a story of competing bluffs, and to her credit, it seems that Chloe Allen was somehow both the victim and the victor. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReofficial, and you might even hear your story featured in the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data. Look at it anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to seal your fart jars.
An enemy has been slain. Earned its blood.
This is a wild encounter that happened to me last year. At the moment, I wasn't so scared, but as I told you the story afterward is when I started to realize how scary and horrific this encounter could have been. One thing my wife and I love to do is hit up garage sales to try to find awesome stuff for cheap. I'm the king of bargains, and I often can't pass them up. I'm left-handed, and one time I got a brand new set of left-handed golf clubs for $30 because the guy was having surgery and wasn't going to be able to golf anymore. And that's the type of deals I hunt for. Well, last year in the middle of the summer, while my wife and I were garage sale hunting, I found what I thought was an estate sale. A fairly large house in my neighborhood was selling just about everything you can think of from the house. The couple running the sale was probably in their mid-30s if I had to guess. I got talking to the guy and found out that it wasn't an estate sale technically, but it was just about everything being sold in the house at that time. The house belonged to the guy's father, who was still alive and sitting in the chair next to the garage. The man explained to us that his father was losing it mentally and that he was going to be living with him. They planned on keeping the house but wanted to get rid of most of the stuff inside so they could renovate it and then have a house they could rent out. Most of the stuff in the garage was just junk. Years worth of clutter that old people tend to accumulate. And then I saw something that caught my eye. It was a really cool military sword. It was engraved with all sorts of writing, had an eagle for the handle, and to cap it off, it looked like it was solid gold. Whether it was or wasn't real gold, I didn't know at the time. I grabbed the sword and asked the man if this was truly for sale. And the guy shrugged it off and said, "Yeah, I'll sell it to you for 25 bucks. I gave him 30 and walked away with my new shiny toy. As I was walking to my car with my wife, I happened to look up and see the old man was now standing up. He looked concerned and almost angry. As I was driving away, I saw the old man walk over to his son, and he appeared to be yelling at him. The son just kept putting his hands up in the air while the old guy was yelling. I was curious as to what they were fighting about, but ultimately I just forgot about it in a few minutes. That night when we got home, we were sitting in the backyard grilling some steaks. I was telling a couple of neighbors that came over about the sword, and it was only a matter of time until I went inside and grabbed it so I could show it off to my buddies. The night continued, and we ate our steaks outside and continued hanging out and enjoying the evening. Around 8 p.m. that night, one of my friends said that he thought that he had heard someone knocking on my front door. I didn't put any stock into that because we were out back, and I figured that there was no way that my friend could have heard that. Not 5 minutes later, I heard my wife scream at the top of her lungs. We all turned around, and storming into my backyard was the old man from the garage sale. He wasn't limping or moving sluggishly. He came back there like a bat out of hell and was making a shot for the sword, which was next to the table in the patio. I started to approach the man calmly, telling him to just hold on and relax, and he didn't listen to me at all.
Get paid.
He grabbed the sword, and I kid you not, he took a swing. Thankfully, he's older and a weaker man, so I was able to just move out of the way. But the man was screaming erratically and claiming that I stole his sword. For some reason, I was still trying to plead with the guy, even though he was trying to stab me. I finally had enough and tackled this guy to the ground. I tried to do it gently because I was scared that I was going to break the guy in half or something. I was trying to figure out in my head how this guy knew where I lived, and I had no idea. My wife called the police, who showed up pretty quickly, and right away the old man started telling them that I stole his sword. I was able to calmly explain to the police that I had bought it at a garage sale and that they could contact the man that I bought it from. It took a while, but the son was finally notified and came rushing over. He must have apologized a million times, and I didn't press charges. The old man clearly wasn't there mentally. Perhaps the most terrifying part was when me, the son, and the cop were talking, the old man snuck over and grabbed the sword. My wife just happened to see him grab it, and she pointed it out right away. I still think to myself, what would that man have done if my wife didn't see him pick up the sword? Would he have tried to use it again? I exchanged numbers with the son just in case I had to reach out to him again, and I became more vigilant of all my locks in the house. I never did give the sword back, and my conscience sort of eats at me for that one.
Whatever works at the time.
Now, in hindsight, I should have just given the sword back and just bought it from the son when the old man died, but I was thinking in the moment. And as of writing this, I still don't know if the man is alive. The only thing I can say for sure is that since that horrible evening in the backyard, I have yet to see that crazy old man again.
Your turret has been destroyed. An ally has been slain.
Ever since I was a little kid, I've loved going to garage sales and estate sales. We didn't have a lot of money growing up, and garage sales were a place that I could find toys or books at prices my parents could afford to pay. As I got older, I just became extremely fascinated with what other people had in their collections and what they were selling. I found everything from vintage Disney snow globes to stamps dating back almost 100 years. Anyway, for the last 7-8 years, myself and a few of my neighbors started a neighborhood garage sale. It started really small, but now I'd say about 50% of the neighborhood participates and other communities drive in to shop at the garage sale. My husband is a collector of many things, so we usually have at least a few good items that we sell for cheap just to get them out of the house. We have a few regulars who come to our sale every year and will grab whatever furniture or large items that we have for sale that year. The story I'm going to share with you now took place 3 years ago in July during our neighborhood sale. In our postings in the newspaper and on social media, we give the hours and the days of the sales. We specifically ask for no early birds because people are usually still setting up their yard sales, before 8 a.m. I usually have everything out in the garage the night before and just drag it out to the driveway the next day. I remember my husband was up having some coffee as he had to work that Saturday. Luckily, his job is work from home, so he just uses his office in the basement. He asked if I needed any help setting up, and I said I was just moving a few tables, but we had some time and he should finish his coffee. At around 7 a.m., I heard a slamming on the door. Yes, a slamming, like somebody was trying to break through the door. I ran to the door and whipped it open and said, "Can I help you?" It was a middle-aged man who replies, "Yeah, I'm here for the sale. It said you had collectibles." And I said, "Yes, I believe we do have some. They're my husband's, but the sale doesn't start for another hour." Now annoyed, he says, "I'm here now, so why don't you just let me look around?" I tried to remain calm and friendly and said, "We aren't quite set up yet, but we do open up at 8 a.m. A big frown came across his face, and he turned around and said that you didn't have to be rude about it.
Shut down.
I thought about yelling something back, but figured that I would just let it go. He got into a rusty maroon pickup truck and just drove off. My husband asked who it was. Sure, I said some sarcastic comment about someone pounding on the door, and him letting me answer it alone and not even coming over to check. The sale started and was busy, as it always is. I was struggling to keep up with the customers early on, but at about 10 a.m., there was a little break in the rush. I put my head down to check my phone and heard someone say, "Hey, how are you?" And to my surprise, it was the same guy from the morning, who seemed to be chipper as ever and completely ignoring our interaction from earlier. He gave me a wide smile that exposed his mouth, which looked like it had a total of 4 teeth. He browsed the collectibles for quite some time and brought up a few baseball cards and checked out. He thanked me and asked if there was anything else for sale, and I said, "Nope, this is it." He said that I was just wondering if maybe he had any more cards or DVDs inside. I told him I could check with my husband and there could potentially be more tomorrow, but for today, this was it. He didn't say anything, just turned around and left. I took a little break around lunchtime to have lunch with my husband. We both ate at the garage while he was on his break. There were a few people browsing, but not many purchases. And that's when I saw the maroon pickup truck pull up in front of the house for the 3rd time today. I leaned over to my husband and said, "This guy's been here twice already, and he was the one banging on the door at 7 a.m. He approached both of us and said, "I was here earlier, and I think you said that there was going to be some more stuff here." I looked at my husband and back at him and said, "That's not the case. My husband's put everything out there for sale, and after checking with him, there won't be anything near or new for tomorrow." The same frown from earlier in the morning was back on his face. He looked at my husband and said, "Can I take a look around inside? I bet you got lots of stuff in there, and I could probably put a good offer on it." My husband said that this is it, but he doesn't have anything else for sale. And now with his big smile on his face, he said, "Are you sure?" My husband cut him off and said, "Listen, that's all we have. I appreciate you stopping by, but if there is anything else you're interested in, I'm sure there are plenty of other sales that might have what you need." And the man nodded, spun around, and got into his truck and left. The rest of the night went off with no issues, and my husband and I made a nice chunk of change for a single-day sale. We honestly did so well that we decided to cancel our second day. I thought that I would stop by a few of my neighbors' houses who still had a lot of stuff and help them for the day. At about 7:15 on Saturday, I went over to Debbie's, and strangely, I noticed her garage was closed and that she wasn't setting anything up yet. She told me to come over at 7, but I came a little late just in case it was too early. After contemplating if I should just go back home or not, I went to the front door. Before I even had a chance to knock, Debbie opened the door in her robe, clutching tissues with her face all red. "What happened?" I asked her. And she said someone came and broke into the garage and took most of her stuff, at least some of the valuable items. Debbie told me to come in and told me the entire story. She was running through it and I cut her off at one point and said, "Can you repeat that?" And she said the only thing that her husband caught when he was running outside was a red pickup truck racing down the street, just fast enough that it wasn't able to get a license plate. I asked if the pickup truck was red and rusty, and her husband overheard and said, "How did you know that?" I told Debbie and her husband about my encounter the day before, and they asked if I would share a description and any other information with the police. Of course, I agreed, but from what I recall, no one was ever charged, and they weren't able to get their belongings back. I know some of you may not think that this post qualifies as a scary encounter, but having the feeling that in your own neighborhood or your own house, you no longer may be safe is one of the rawest fears there is in the world.
Shut down.
I still get sick to my stomach when I think about this story and have since installed new security systems and cameras around our property. I still do love garage sailing, but since this event 3 years ago, I only shop and I don't host. Sometimes I just think I have bad luck. I'm almost 30 years old and I can't seem to find myself a nice partner to settle down with. I've gone on a million dates. I tried the whole Tinder thing, and I've even had friends set me up on blind dates. And I just can't seem to find that special connection with anyone, no matter how hard I try. The story I'm about to tell you happened to me a few years ago, and I don't know if it was just desperation or just plain bad luck, but it still haunts me to this day. It started on a beautiful summer day. I happened to be off from work on a Saturday, which never happens, and I decided to try and make the most of it. I had recently moved to a new neighborhood a few months prior to the events of this story and was excited to see that my neighbor was having a bunch of yard sales. Because I usually worked on Saturdays, I always tend to miss the yard sales, so the fact that I could actually check them out on this specific Saturday, I was thrilled. I hit a few houses on my street that weren't really selling anything worthwhile. As I continued to make my way through the neighborhood, I found a couple of little treasures. One house that I stopped at was selling a bunch of guitars and drum sets. Since I play guitar, I was interested right away. I grabbed this lime green acoustic guitar the guy was selling, and while I was inspecting the instrument, I heard this voice behind me say, "Hey, sweet guitar, you play?" I turned around and said yes at the same time. What I didn't expect to see was a beautiful woman smiling at me, and she was completely my type. She was dressed in a punk rock style, covered in tattoos, and most notably, she had green hair. I'm not one to engage with people so easily, but she had a certain charm about her that I was sucked right into her gaze. We ended up making small talk for nearly half an hour at this poor guy's yard sale. And finally, the guy said that I had to either buy the guitar or leave since I had been holding it the entire time that this girl had been talking. I told her it was nice meeting her and then went and paid the guy. I remember walking home with the guitar in my hand, kind of beating myself up that I didn't get her number. I didn't even get her name. And then I remember feeling this rush of joy, because from several feet behind me, I heard her voice. She was asking me to stop, and when I did, she ran over and grabbed my hand and said, "I know this sounds crazy, but I really like talking to you. We had a connection, you know, and I think it'd be crazy if we both ignored it. Would you maybe want to hang out?" I was so excited, but I was trying to play it cool. I remember laughing and telling her my name, to which she replied with hers. She said her name was Moon. Yes, it was Moon. And we joked and continued our small talk again for another few minutes. I eventually worked up the courage to ask her out for a drink, and I guess I shouldn't have been surprised when she said yes. We went to a local bar, shared a few drinks, and then one thing led to another, and I asked her to come back to my place. And again, she went with it. We had an amazing night. We stayed up for a while, playing Mario Party, and then ended the night on a high note. I went to bed in probably one of the best moods I've ever been in. That quickly changed when I woke up at around 4 in the morning. I noticed that she wasn't lying next to me anymore. I sat up in bed and noticed that my bedroom door was shut, which I never shut my door.
Whatever works at the time.
I snuck over to the door and opened it slowly. I thought that I could hear the sound of breaking glass coming from downstairs. I was still groggy from waking up, so I wasn't moving too fast. As I was going down the stairs, I shouted Moon's name. And before I went all the way downstairs, I heard her yell something under her breath, and then heard the back door slam. I finally started to move with some haste, and that's when I noticed that I was too late. My kitchen was completely destroyed. There was glass everywhere. I started to freak out, and then my anger turned to sadness. This woman had not only trashed my kitchen, but she also robbed me blind. All my records were gone, and 2 of my guitars were gone as well. I had a china cabinet that had a bunch of my family heirlooms, and all of that was gone. She had taken everything that I had of real value, and I ran out the back door trying to find her. My logic was telling me that there was no way that she could have carried all that stuff out, but when I got outside, she was nowhere to be found. And reality started to set in, and I realized how hard I'd been played. Clearly this woman had a plan all along, and she had to have someone else with her because she would never have been able to get away so fast. I obviously reported this incident to the police, but there was nothing that ever came of it. I could describe her appearance, but nobody matching her description was ever caught. Moon must have just been some fake name because nobody in the area had the name Moon.
I won't die.
And when I reflect on this now, years later, I can notice some red flags. Like, where did she come from that day? I never bothered to ask. She didn't drive a car, so I guess I assumed she lived in the neighborhood. She was dependent on me the entire evening, and instead of looking at this as some type of issue, I was more into the idea that she needed me. I never did get my stuff back, and now I'm ever more careful and selective with whom I bring into my home. And be careful, because sometimes the people we're closest with, the people we trust, can be the monsters that are right under our noses the entire time. I'd like to say that some men are just creeps, but honestly some people in general are just creeps as well. When my husband was out of town for his job, I decided to have a garage sale with my mom and 2 sisters. We all lived relatively close, so we just had the yard sale at my house since I had a really big front yard. None of us were selling anything that was really that exciting, just a bunch of extra stuff that we had all collected over the years. About an hour into the sale, a normal-looking guy approached me and didn't have anything in his hands to buy. I asked if I could help him, to which he replied in this sort of calm voice, saying, "No." The interaction was weird, but seemed harmless. I dismissed it somehow. I can't remember exactly what I said, and walked away. Not 2 minutes later, the man approached me again. I had my back turned to him, but I could feel him walking up behind me. Instead of turning and saying anything, the man said, "Hello, dear. You have the most amazing eyes." I turned and gave the guy this half smile as I thanked him, and I continued to walk around, just trying to distance myself from this creep. I sort of felt bad for a minute because what if this guy was just genuinely trying to be nice, and I was being as cold as can be? When he approached me the 3rd time, he had some shirts or something in his hands, and he says, "I'm sorry I was so blunt earlier. I hope I didn't offend you." I smiled and apologized for my cold demeanor, and I told him that it was all right and that I didn't mind the compliment. That was my mistake. I gave the guy an inch and he took a mile, and he immediately said, "Oh, okay, good. Well, we should go out sometime." I was pretty floored by the statement, and I told him that I was married and I wasn't interested. He then started to beg me, saying things like, "Forget about your husband. I'm a real man." And my personal favorite, "What even is marriage? It's just a fancy word." Now I was angry and annoyed. and I told the man that he needed to leave right now. He got angry and upset and tried to play this victim card, but he left after a minute or two. About an hour later, a pretty woman came up to me with a huge smile on her face, saying, "Hello, dear. You have the most amazing eyes." I looked at her with a little disgust because she said exactly what the other guy said